Hi, this is Joe from Mapmundi, and today I'd like to talk about doublets in the English language. So every language that I know has doublets. Every language that I've studied has doublets in some capacity. English has quite a lot of doublets due to its external history. The English language has had huge influences from French and Latin, obviously due to William the Conqueror, Norman French in 1066, arriving to the island of Britain. And then also obviously Latin being a language of prestige, it's had a lot of influence on the English language as the language of Christianity and Catholicism historically. So the first question is, what is a doublet, or what are doublets? Doublets are in languages when you have two or more words that have different pronunciations and oftentimes different meanings, but they come from the same source ultimately. So they're words that come from the same source, but they've had phonological changes that separate them in pronunciation from one another, and they can either have similar meanings or quite different meanings depending on how the languages have evolved. And sometimes due to the extensive sound changes that have happened as Proto-Indo-European has evolved, sometimes doublets can be very difficult to recognize, and other times they can be pretty simple to recognize. For example, I don't think anybody would be very surprised if I told you that the word to, as in T-O, and the word as in to, T-O-O, that those words are related. They both come from the same source. I don't think that that would be extremely groundbreaking. Or a word like cattle, as in cows, and chattel, as in something that you kind of trade around. I don't think anybody would be very surprised to learn that those two words come from the same source because they are very phonologically similar. However, we can sometimes have doublets that come from two different sources that can be quite different. For example, the word head and the word capital ultimately come from the same source. The word have and the word capture ultimately come from the same source. So you could say that those are doublets because they have the same etymon, the same parent word that both of them come from. And the way that these doublets work, they can work in a few different ways. One way that we can have, in the example I just showed you of to and to, T-O and T-O-O, is that those languages are both of native origin to the English language, but they can split and become two different words, words that mean two different things, just kind of based on natural sound changes and the way that languages evolve from one another. What we see happening pretty commonly in English is that we have one word that is borrowed from a foreign source, and we have one word that is inherited from the native Proto-Germanic English descendant. So for example, there are a lot of words in English that are doublets between borrowed and inherited words between Norse languages, French, and also Latin. Some examples of words that are borrowed words from Norse, which they've been borrowed a long time ago, but they're still borrowed words ultimately. We can have doublets such as shirt and skirt. Those words come from the same source. We can have shin and skin. We can have ship and skip. So all those sh sounds, those are the inherited sound from the English language, and all those sk sounds are the borrowed sounds from the Norse languages. So we can see that at some point in time, those sk sounds in English evolved to sh sounds. Once that evolutionary process ended, then there was some kind of contact with Norse languages, and the English language borrowed those sk words back in. Since the evolution of sk to sh was something that already happened at that time period, the evolution wasn't going to happen again. So then we're left with two words like shirt and skirt, and as we can see, those words are somewhat related. They're both clothing items, but they do have pretty distinct meanings, right? Or skin and shin. Those meanings, I mean, they're both body parts in a way, but they have slightly distinct meanings. So oftentimes what will happen is with doublets that the meanings of the words are similar, but not quite the same. An even more common situation that happens in the English language is that oftentimes we will have one word of Germanic origin, which would be the native word. We have one word of French origin due to the influence of French with William the Conqueror. And then we can oftentimes have another word from Latin origin, which is a learned word, from the scholarly language of Latin as it was used in England at that time period. So we're left sometimes with words that have similar meanings, but that have slightly different phonological realizations. For example, the word regal and the word royal Royal is a word that we borrowed from French. I think the word in French is royaux. And in Latin, we have the word regalis. So obviously, those two words come from different origins. Royal comes from French, royaux, and English regal comes from regalis. And then those two words actually, funnily enough, do ultimately come from the same source, because obviously a lot of Latin vocabulary comes from French. So royaux also comes from regalis. Another very common thing that happens in the English language when we have these doublets is that they have a difference in register. Oftentimes the word that comes from Germanic origin is considered to be the more basic form of the word, and the word that's from French or Latin origin is considered to be the more elegant version of the word, the more cultivated version of the word. And that obviously is due to this social conditioning that's been in effect in England for hundreds of years, that French was the language of the aristocracy and royal people, along with Latin being a learned language. It was a scholarly language, and this native English language being the language of everyday kind of people. So over time, we've developed this idea that these, words that come from French and Latin are of a higher educatory status than the words of native Germanic words. And in the English language, we also have oftentimes doublets that will come from French, but two different versions of French. Obviously, when William the Conqueror came, he was from Normandy, so he spoke Norman French. He spoke Norman French from 1066. And then we can oftentimes have words that come from a more modern or standard version of French. For example, the word castle is a word that has been borrowed from Norman French at an early point in time. And the word chateau is a relatively recent word that has been borrowed from modern French. So we can see how the word chateau is something that it resembles the language that's borrowed from to a much higher extent, because it is a much more recent borrowing. When words are borrowed into languages, they will still evolve with the phonological sound changes of that language. So the sooner a word is borrowed into another language, the more distant it's going to become from the parent language, if that makes any sense. Obviously, the parent language can evolve as well. Like if you borrow a word from 1000 AD from French, in English it might evolve this way, in French it might evolve this way, so they're still different from the main parent language. But oftentimes I think that the borrowed language will evolve to a higher degree because it's a foreign kind of source. And even though French and Latin are very large groups of borrowed words for English, we also have other sources, especially in more modern times. For example, we do have a lot of learned words or borrowed words from Greek. For example, the word zealous and the word jealous. Jealous is the word that is the inherited word. I believe that word is actually borrowed from French via Latin, via Greek. And the word zealous is a more recent borrowing that comes from a more recent version of Greek. And when we start to look at more recent words, because now we live in such a kind of modern and connected world, oftentimes we can have words that were borrowed from other languages into English hundreds of years ago, kind of when this transatlantic and maritime world was kind of opening up in a more regular way. And then we'll have a word that now is re-borrowed in more modern times, because now with the internet and even more easy travel, things are actually becoming more culturally connected. For example, the word tea in English is a word that was borrowed, I think, from a dialect in China hundreds of years ago. And we also have the word in English, chai. Chai is a type of tea. Chai and tea originally come from the same source, but obviously chai reflects a certain kind of tea or caffeine drink, and tea is just the general word for it. So we can see examples of that happening too, and sometimes it can be interesting because a word can be borrowed from English into a foreign language and then back into English. For example, if you think of a word like tennis, tennis is a word that comes from Old French. I believe it was tenir, which means to hold. And then that tennis is quite old, so that word was borrowed probably sometime in the early Renaissance or late Middle Ages or who knows when. And then now the word has evolved into tennis in English, but now in modern French, instead of using the old word tenir, they use tennis. So we can see how the word originally came from French, evolved into English, and then was borrowed into French again. And another example we can see in English of that happening could be a word like anime. Anime now in English depicts a very specific type of animation, a Japanese style of animation. That word anime itself, the Japanese word, comes from the English word animation. So the logical order was animation from English into anime in Japanese, and then back into English with the word anime, which now has a slightly more specific or culturally specific meaning, which is a certain type of animation. So words are borrowed from languages all the time. Borrowings have been happening since the beginning of time. It's oftentimes in English sometimes even hard to surmise what might have been borrowed at a very early stage, because when you look at words that are borrowed from Norse languages, early Old English and Old Norse, they're pretty similarly related languages, so we can see how it could be a little bit mysterious in some circumstances as to whether a word in English is borrowed from Norse, inherited from Old English, or if perhaps it was inherited from English but reinforced from Old Norse and kind of maintained or changed its phonological sounds due to some kind of interaction or contact with Norse-speaking people from that time period. And I focused on English today, but as I said before, English is not the only language that has doublets and borrowing and inherited words. When I translate Italian with my students, oftentimes my students like to translate poetry and opera libretti. So when I translate Italian with my students back into English, we can oftentimes see examples of doublets where there will be an inherited word from the Latin language, but there will also be a later borrowing from the Latin language, and the later borrowing always resembles the Latin word to a much higher extent than the inherited word, because the inherited word has had time to evolve over hundreds of years. And a really easy example I can give would be something like the word for bad or guilty, or something like that in Italian would be the word rio. Rio in Italian means bad, guilty. We also have the version reo. Reo also means guilty or bad. Both those words ultimately come from the Latin word reus, which means bad or guilty. And we can see that the Italian version, the inherited word, has changed the vowel sound from an e to an e, but then now the borrowed word resembles the Latin version more closely, so we have reo instead of rio. And again, obviously those borrowed words from Latin and Italian are considered a little bit more educated and prestigious than the inherited words, because they're the language of Latin, and Latin is, considered in the Western world to be a language of learning and education. So there's a lot more I could say about borrowed words. I find it very interesting that this borrowing sensation is something that happens a lot. I would say the history of the evolution of languages could be, solely summed up on the fact that words were borrowed in antiquity all the time from one another, and as I said, it can be a little bit difficult to surmise what might have been borrowed or not borrowed when you go back thousands of years. And as far as I know, I don't think there are really any languages now in 2020 that don't have examples of borrowings, and probably doublets as well, because we live in such a society now where these kinds of new concepts, new cultural ideas, and new materials are introduced to one another all the time. I could imagine that probably before this kind of interconnected world we have now, there could potentially have been a kind of isolated language which might not have had this kind of concept of borrowings. Presumably they probably still had doublets, because they probably still had words that evolved natively from the same source. But I don't know of any languages that exist like that, because my focus is Indo-European languages and on the continent of Europe and Asia. Obviously there's a lot of contact from different languages. It's not like it's like a kind of isolated island nation somewhere that's very far away from everything. So if you enjoyed this topic and you'd like to see more discussions like this in the future, then subscribe to my channel Mappa Moody Languages to see a new video coming out every Friday.